Welcome to Measures of Truth, a His Dark Materials podcast. I'm Caitlin.
I'm Alan.
And I'm Anya. And we're discussing chapters 1 through 4 of The Golden Compass. The Decanter of Tukey, The Idea of North, Lyris Jordan, and the Alethiometer.
And so since we're reading the book and there are two names for the book, we just wanted to talk about that for a second here up front. So if you are in North America, then this is the Golden Compass. Everyone else has the Northern Lights. And I guess this was originally, the series itself was originally supposed to be the Golden Compasses. Is that right, Caitlin?
Yes.
Which comes from the Milton poem, Paradise Lost, the name Golden Compasses. And then the series is called His Dark Materials, which is, of course, also from Milton's poem. And I know that we've talked about this before off mic, but I think I'm the only one who's actually read that poem out of the three of us, right?
I believe I've read some excerpts, but not the whole thing.
Nope.
It's pretty rad if people like dark poetry. It gets boring once the humans come in, which is my critique of it. One of the greatest English poems ever. Down with humans, says
Are we going to have to podcast about it?
No, absolutely
Okay,
not.
good.
I wouldn't make you read that poem. Okay, so the Golden Compasses line is basically like talking about the creation of the universe and all this stuff. And I just wanted to read the part of that like real quick. So you can imagine that like God is like out there in this wild chaos and he's like creating the universe. And the way that he does it, for chaos heard his voice, him and all his train followed in bright procession to behold creation and the wonders of his might. Then stayed the fervid wheels, and in his hands he took the golden compasses prepared in God's eternal store to circumscribe this universe and all created things. And so you like have there the golden compasses, right? But His Dark Materials is what it's called, which I think is the better name for this series. And that was Pullman's choice. But the English publisher, or not the English publishers, the American publishers liked the Golden Compass so much they wanted it for the first book, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or so the internet tells me.
Right.
When Pullman told them that the series was the Golden Compasses, they like misunderstood and thought it was the name of the first book. And then when he changed his mind and was like, actually, it's going to be His Dark Materials, they were like, oh, but can we keep the Golden Compass? And he was just kind of like, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I actually like the Golden Compass as a name once you throw in there like the amber spyglass and the subtle knife. Like it feels like those names are all connected to each other in a way that like the Northern Lights just doesn't fit in with those other two, I think.
I mean, it's technically an adjective and a noun, but not quite in the same way. It's more of like a compound.
It's like a place.
Thing, yep.
Well, it's a place instead of a thing, I guess.
Mm.
Or like a magical artifact.
Well, Northern Lights is just a natural phenomena.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like the other two are not. They're things.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
like
exactly.
you could think of the alethiometer as the golden compass, so it like fits better.
I just like Northern Lights because I bought my copy of the book in England, so it's called Northern Lights.
I could see that.
I'm just glad that the reason the titles are different isn't because they thought American audiences would be too dumb, because that's what it usually is.
Oh, yeah. Like
I've
Harry
had
Potter,
multiple arguments with American friends about the Sorcerer's Stone. 'Cause it is stupid.
Shall we move on to summaries?
Yes, we shall.
Okay.
Well, actually, just before we start our book discussion, let's read the epigraph, epitaph. Which one of those is on a tomb?
Epitaph is on a tomb. Epigraph is on a...
Let's read the epigraph that he did go with for the name that the series did stick with. I can give it a go if we want to hear me read some Milton.
Go for it.
With some fun punctuation. Into this wild abyss, the womb of nature, and perhaps her grave, of neither sea, nor shore, nor air, nor fire, but all these in their pregnant causes mix confusedly, and which thus must ever fight, unless the Almighty Maker them ordain his dark materials to create more worlds. Into this wild abyss, the wary fiend stood on the brink of hell and looked a while, pondering his voyage. Which does give us quite a different sort of intro than the Golden Compasses quote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's much less about creation and much more ominous sounding, I think.
Totally. Yeah. It also like emphasizes like there's a big theme in that poem of like the compass is like this kind of rational kind of, it's like mathematical and you know, like as opposed to the chaos, which is like, you know, kind of boundless and irrational, and that's associated with Satan. The golden compass is associated with God. And I think that overall, like this series is more sympathetic to the Satan position in Milton's work because he's like more individualistic. He's more curious and passionate. And like, so it's like, it's a much better quote for him to go with. But I think there's also like in this book, especially, and in the series, there's a big thing of like rationality versus irrationality, which is the same theme as Milton, but it's not associated with like the same polemic of like goodness equals rationality, evil equals irrationality. Exactly. Anyway, something that I think is important for the series.
I guess, okay, so now I'm basing what I'm going to say on like vague memories from high school English lit. But Paradise Lost is also like Satan is the protagonist in that.
No, I would not
Really?
agree with that reading.
I'm not saying that he's a good guy.
No, he's
just
not.
saying he's like...
He's important in the first part of it and then becomes like less important as it
maybe
goes
that's the
on.
only bit that we read in English lit then.
Yeah.
And so we just talked about it from that point of view.
God is definitely the protagonist. He's like, the whole thing is like, God's in control of everything. And that's awesome, is basically the idea of that poem.
Okay, well then we can stop talking. Or I can cut that out. Me being a fool.
No. I think a lot of people think that, to be honest with you, because like the romantics come back to it and that's the only part they care about. And honestly, it's like the best part.
Okay.
But yeah.
Well, I was just saying that then I think it's important that he decided to include a line from Satan's perspective and not from God's perspective.
Yes. And to emphasize the satanic dark materials instead of the godly, like rational, mathematical compasses.
Oh, see, I read the dark materials as belonging to God.
I mean, God's in charge of everything, but it's like, this is neither fire nor the sea, nor it's like nothing. It's like chaos. That's like what the universe is made of, except for heaven and hell. And it's like, God can turn it into anything, but that's where Satan has his home. He makes Castle Pandemonium floating in the chaos and like rides the chaos between hell and earth. And
right. Gotcha. It also includes a line about making more worlds.
Yeah.
Which
also important.
Also important. All right. Now let's get into our discussion of the chapters.
Okay, so we're going to do just like some brief chapter summaries at the beginning of each episode because we assume that probably not all of the listeners are going to have read the book super recently. In Chapter 1, we meet Lyra Belacqua, a young girl living at Jordan College in Oxford, and her demon Pantalaimon as they're sneaking into the scholars' retiring room. While there, they're surprised by an early visit from the master of the college and the butler, who discuss the imminent arrival of Lyra's uncle, Lord Asriel. The butler leaves, and Lyra witnesses the master put poison in the wine left out for Lord Asriel. The master leaves, and Lyra decides to hide in the wardrobe to warn her uncle about the poison. Once he arrives, and she does so, he tells her to hide again and to spy on the master for him.
And then in chapter 2, the master and other scholars come in, and Lord Asriel begins a slideshow, and Lyra, and therefore the reader, are introduced to some holy shit plot moments. But not before they fry up some poppy and get high, because that's what you do.
No, Caitlin, it clarifies the mind and makes for better conversation.
Yeah.
I mean,
we learned that Lord...
I was just going to say, to be fair, I know a lot of academics who smoke pot, but...
I feel like pop and opium are kind of on two different levels.
Okay, that's fair.
And are they part of a state-sponsored church, massive dystopian organization? Because I was like, that's weird. The chaplain is like, yeah, cut up some poppy, let's go.
Well, we can talk more about that later, but that was like one of the interesting clues for like setting and placing the book in time that I thought was interesting.
Oh, yeah. This chapter is full of those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So we learn that Lord Asriel and also someone named Grumman have been researching capital D dust in the Arctic North. Asriel shows a picture of an adult man attracting dust to him that's like coming down from the sky, and a child beside him that is not attracting dust. Someone asks if this child is severed. Asriel says that he isn't, but we learn nothing more about that, and everybody in the room kind of wishes it hadn't been brought up. Throughout their talks of the North, Panzerbjorna are also mentioned, and that somebody named Jofur Ragnarsson is the king of the bears. Asriel shows a picture of another world visible through the northern lights, and as they are all coming around to voting on whether or not to give him some money to go and research all this some more, he shows them the severed head of Grumman, who used to be a scholar at the college, and he found that he was dead somewhere in the north. This seems under the impression that Grumman has been murdered by some people. This convinces everyone to give Asriel the money and send him north. Lyra falls asleep in the wardrobe she's hiding in while everyone discusses giving Asriel some money, and then after they all have left, she reports what she saw to him and goes back to her room. After that, we get a little aside that is not told from Lyra's perspective, with the master of the college and the librarian discussing why it puts the college in a bad place politically to support Asriel. The master mentions something called the alethiometer, and that Lyra is going to get involved in all these politics somehow. And I believe this is also where he mentions that she will betray someone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is this where we find out she'll be an expert in dust, or is that later?
I believe that is later. Or it might be here.
Well.
I think it's in chapter 3.
It's later, yeah. And that chapter has chapter 2 there, or I guess chapter 1 has the first Narnia allusion in it.
Yes,
right?
she hides in the
she's
wardrobe.
in a wardrobe.
Mm.
Yeah.
And it's one of the first things she does. She hides in a wardrobe in order to overhear all these men talking about important political things and important theological things. And instead of finding a different world in a wardrobe, she discovers more about her own world and is brought into this adventure in a different way.
Yeah, I really love how it's all inverted. It's like she went into a world of science instead of a world of like magic.
Mm-hmm.
It's like her world is magic, and then it's like, oh, here's this scientific exposition. It's cool.
In chapter 3, we learn about Lyra and her friend Roger and their lives in and around Jordan College. We learn that Lyra lives a sort of double life, as a nobly born child being raised in a college where scholars try to teach her things, and one of a mostly wild street urchin who takes charge and is imaginative and a leader. Then we hear about children disappearing, and we get a story told about Tony Makarios and his demon Ratter as they're taken away by an elegant lady and her golden monkey demon. We hear several versions of the legend of the child-stealing gobblers before Egyptian boy named Billy and Lyra's friend Roger go missing. Just as Lyra has resolved herself that she's going to go rescue Roger, she's forced to go to dinner with the master and some visiting scholars, where she meets a beautiful woman named Mrs. Coulter, who has a golden monkey demon. Ooh. And then, in another third-person aside, we find out that Lyra will eventually become the world's leading expert in dust.
And then in chapter 4, Mrs. Coulter immediately intrigues Lyra, tells her about the North and everything that she's done and the exploration she's been on, and Lyra is completely transfixed by her. The Master of Jordan takes Lyra aside after the meal to tell her that she will no longer be living at Jordan College, but will be going away with Mrs. Coulter. Lyra seems very excited about this. The next morning, before Lyra leaves, the master has her come visit him in secret, where he gives her an instrument called an alethiometer. He quickly says that he wishes he could have prevented her going off with Mrs. Coulter, but he can't, and tells her that the instrument that he's just given her tells the truth, and it was given to the college by Azrael some years ago, and that she must keep it secret from Mrs. Coulter. Lyra sets off to London, and only then remembers that Roger is missing, but it once again leaves her mind quickly as she is entranced by all things London and Coulter. Mrs. Coulter takes Lyra all around London, showing her amazing sights and takes her shopping and just introducing her to this whole different world she never knew. At the end of the day, Lyra and Pan take a look at the alethiometer again and wonder why the master gave it to them, and Pan reminds Lyra that she is to keep it secret from Mrs. Coulter. And that is the first part of the book.
We also get another Narnia reference there with her tempting the little Egyptian boy, Billy, with chocolate. The way that
that's
witch...
Tony.
Oh, the Tony. Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Well, it's basically the same idea as what happens in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the evil queen, or whatever you want to call her,
bitch.
I guess the witch, yeah, offers candy to a child who's like, sounds great, stranger, and then gets... I almost said gets Norded, which is a totally different mythology. But anyway, it's clearly a Narnia reference.
Yeah, and thus C.S. Lewis convinced dozens of American children that Turkish Delight was actually good until we tried it and realized it wasn't.
Oh, it's so bad. Oh my God.
Yeah, I'm not a fan either of the Turkish Delight.
Hot chocolate, way better. Or whatever she's offering.
Yeah.
It's hot chocolate, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so actually, yeah, that's called chocolatl, which is, because it's originally from the Nahuatl word, which is Nahuatl's the language that the Aztec people spoke before they were forced to learn Spanish instead.
Interesting. So I wonder if that's the case in this world.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're kind of getting ahead of where things are in the doc, but it's clearly one of those choices where it's like things are just slightly off, right? Like if it's not necessarily that like the Aztecs weren't forced to learn Spanish in this world, but maybe the Spanish were just like a little bit better at listening, and so when they brought chocolate back to the old world, people like were able to pronounce it correctly.
It's an interesting take that he has to the world building, because it's not like he starts off and says, this is a different world where parts of people's souls exist outside of them, and, it's kind of like ours, but slightly different, and some things are sometimes called blah, 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 blah. So much as he just drops in people saying things or thinking things, and it all seems very organic.
Yeah, I completely agree.
I really love the world building in this series.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Like, not to make a pun of it, but it's the strongest thing, I think, in the book, next to Lyra herself as a character.
Agreed. I love Lyra.
Yeah.
All right. Favorite parts in these first couple chapters? We put me at the top, so I guess I'll go first, even though I just introed the section, and it's weird. But anyways, my favorite part is just the opening line. I think Philip Pullman, as we've seen in other books of his also, is just really good at like opening bits and having you immediately sucked into the story. So the opening line here is, Lyra and her demon moved through the darkening hall, taking care to keep to one side, out of sight of the kitchen. And it immediately grabs you because, like, what the heck is a demon? What is this hall that they're in? Why is she sneaking about?
Yeah.
And then she goes and, like, she rings that glass.
Yeah.
And it's just immediately, and Pan is immediately like, what are you doing? Let's go. We're sneaking in here. We're not doing this. And it's just so much character within like one small paragraph.
That's a good point. There's a lot of tension there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really something that a kid can plug into too, right? Like she's up to something. And I think any child can like immediately sympathize with that energy and kind of jump into her mind right away. Yeah, that's a really good point.
And I guess we don't quite know what demons are yet, but they are like a part of the person's soul, but just that exists outside and you can talk to them. And I love any time that the person and their demon are kind of at odds with each other, because it just makes so much sense to me that if you had a piece of yourself outside of yourself, you would be constantly arguing with it, you know, because you'd have those in your head conversations, but you could have them outside. You'd be like, well, this will be a good idea. And then you're like, maybe it's not such a good idea. And I don't know. That just makes complete sense to me.
That was actually going to be one of my questions, or like things to look at going forward. There's like this very clear dynamic between Lyra and Pan where like Lyra's more reckless and Pan is much more conservative and like wants to be like safe and careful. And I'm interested in seeing like what other kinds of dynamics, like are demons and their humans always set up as these kind of like opposing forces, or like what other pictures of that human demon relationship do we get to see?
Well, I mean, in these chapters alone, we do get to see Azrael and Stelmaria talk a little bit. And that one, it does feel a little bit different. And I like because they're both, what is it? Like she kind of gives him some advice. Mm-hmm. Like she talks about how tired they are and that they should get some sleep. And he's just like, yes, I know. And we should do this and we should do this, but it's not going to happen. And they don't argue. They just sort of do what they have to do. And it's interesting that juxtaposition of like an adult and his demon and a child and her demon.
Yeah. My impression is that at least so far, the adults and their demons are like much more on the same page. And I wonder if, you know, if that has something to do with like how you and your demon mature as you reach adulthood.
I have a lot of thoughts about all this, but I have it in our later section about religion.
Alrighty, let's move on to your favorite bit then.
I really love Lyra like as a storyteller in these chapters, especially when they're talking about the gobblers or when she's retelling stories about Lord Asriel, and just how like a living person she just lifts off the page, you know, like she's very easy to believe in. And I was a kid like this, like we were moving constantly and like my home life was like really traumatic. And so like I recognize Lyra immediately as someone who's like me. And like I would be on the playground and talking about like what my last school experience was like, but I'm not telling the like just the facts ma'am version. I'm telling the legend of like how I had to like, you know, fight off 50 dogs by myself. And I lost my gun in that battle. And that's why I don't have my gun anymore. But I'm totally an undercover cop, you guys, and stuff like that. Because she like has this like, you know, bigger than real life kind of view of the world, this kind of epic view of the world that kind of compensates for all this loneliness that she seems to feel. And I just love her as a character and a storyteller.
I wonder if there's something about the fact that she's like given this truth perceiving instrument and she starts out as like such a liar. And like her name, even Lyra, has like, it sounds a little bit in that direction.
Yeah.
I also, in the vein of her telling lies, like how it's set up as like he doesn't come out and say Lyra's good at lying. You know, he shows her telling Azrael the story about them catching a rook and healing it and setting it free. And then later on she tells Mrs. Coulter that they caught a rook and they roasted it. And it's like, which one did you do? And you genuinely just don't even know which one happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or if either of them happened, who even knows? Maybe there was no rook.
Right. Yeah, if you asked Roger, you'd probably get a very different story.
Yeah.
She's just this wild kid out there. Yeah, it's so good. Like Lyra is fabulous. And so that was like easily like the best thing going on here, I thought.
Anya?
So my favorite part was how Pullman has set up the world where both we and Lyra don't really know who to trust. I mean, it's pretty clear, at least to the reader, that Mrs. Coulter's fucking evil. But I think it's pretty ambiguous between Lord Asriel and the Master, like who has better motivations and who Lyra would be better off trusting. And I also really like the world building that we've kind of talked about, where he's just like sprinkled in all of these bits that are like very intriguing and don't make a lot of sense. And I want to make sure that we revisit the chapter 1 scene at the end of the book and kind of like see how we can reinterpret the scene with the bigger picture.
The scene where the Master was going to poison Asriel?
Or maybe chapter 2, Lord Asriel's presentation about everything that happened up north. Yeah, sorry, chapter 2.
I mean, a lot of that is kind of explained in the conversation between the Master and the librarian, where they're talking about how, the other world theories have been kind of made heresy by the very powerful church. And now Asriel has convinced Jordan College to fund his expedition to research this other world theory. So now Jordan College is kind of in this in-between political place where if they upset the church, bad things could happen to them, but they couldn't really say no to Asriel and all these things. And it's just a very political bit.
Yeah, I don't know. As I was reading it, I kind of felt like there was a lot of subtlety there that I wasn't getting and that I thought would make more sense if I revisited it later.
All right, yeah. I mean, it does make sense to actually... there's another bit in there that we should actually revisit later on. Anyway.
And can we talk about our least favorite parts, too? Because I kind of hate how Pullman is constantly calling everyone dim-witted and stupid, and I feel like it's not intentional. Like, as the third-person narrator, I think that's, like, his disdain for people seeping through. But maybe that's just my take.
I always thought that, because usually when he's calling people that, it's when he's with Lyra, and he's explaining Lyra's, view of the world.
But a lot of it is, or at least some of them are, like, in scenes where she's not there, and, like, she would have no way of being there.
Okay. All the ones I think of are mostly her talking about the servants at her college are obviously not as smart and wonderful as the scholars, and, like, the scholars from other colleges and the town people are obviously dumber than everybody at her college. And it's just obvious this, like, weird, skewed view of the world that she's got being raised somewhere that most people just go for education. And even then, you develop, like, a loyalty.
Oh, yeah.
So her being raised there has created this, like, uber loyalty.
No, that totally makes sense. I'm talking more about the ones where he's talking about, like, some of the kids who get kidnapped. I may have been Tony.
Okay.
And I feel like Tony's mom too. Like, it feels like a bit of classism kind of seeping in, like disdain towards the stupid poor people.
Yeah, his mom is painted as like she's very drunk. She can't really remember who the father was. She's very careless with him, and she, is not aware of where he is or like what his life is like. And so I could see that reading that is like talking down to her as like a person. I could see that.
Yeah.
I can see it too, but in the case of Tony, I honestly don't know. It might be Pullman's own classism. I have no idea how he feels about poor people, honestly. But I don't know, like he talks about how she doesn't remember who Tony's father was, but he never really, like, there's no judgment about it.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about how she's a drunk and they're poor. But then he also has that heartbreaking line afterwards when, like, she never sees Tony again and how she blamed herself and would just cry herself to sleep or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there, too, you're supposed to, like, notice that the gobblers are not targeting, like, rich kids. Like, they're being preyed on, poorer people are. And so I think you are supposed to be sympathetic, but maybe that is why it's hitting, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Anya, but, like, why it's hitting her is like dissonance, because it, on the one hand, it feels like they're being talked down about. And then on the other hand, we're being invited to be sympathetic, to their situation.
Yeah, I think you articulated that better than I was able to, but that's kind of what I was feeling.
I feel a little bit uncomfortable in the same ways as what you're saying sometimes with his use of language. And I think like Caitlin said, a lot of it is to show like this kind of internalized bias that Lyra has about, you know, her view of the world is like the Jordan College view. And she's not aware of that in the same way that like kids always are. They like parrot their parents and like fat people are lazy, right, mom? Because that's like what they have heard their whole life. And, you know, that kind of way.
Well, I think it's fairly obvious when he's doing it on purpose. And then I think there are some places where it's like his own bias he's slipping in.
The one that gets me is how he makes specific, like this comes up more than once in this book, not to get ahead of ourselves, but that servants always have dogs for demons.
Yeah.
I'm like, I think that's quite the generalization, actually. And
does that mean that
kind of shitty?
And does that mean that like everyone has their profession chosen by puberty? Like, are you just like not allowed to be a servant if your demon's not a dog?
We don't know that yet.
What if
we don't know that yet? You're getting ahead of yourself. Shit. That's a spoiler.
Okay.
No, it's fine. I'll leave that in. It's fine.
It's okay.
the like one spoiler that I'm actually capable of making. Great. Because I don't remember anything else about how this book ends. That's not true. I remember a little bit. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. Just that, like, it doesn't really make sense, right? Like, what if you're noble-born and you end up with a demon that settles as a dog? You know?
Yeah, I'm sure it must happen. Like, just because you're a nobly born person doesn't mean you're not the type of person who is kind of, you know, that you value clear instructions and order and, like, the pack. You know? Like, that seems perfectly reasonable. You're not born to your person, or like your station in life is not your personality.
Yeah.
So I think stuff like that is kind of shitty.
Sounds like a lot of heresy to me. I think both of you better watch it.
I'm very much looking forward to our wrap-up episode where we will get to assign each other our demon identities.
Yeah. So I think we talked about it in our scrapped episode. So I'll just say, years ago, people asked, if I'm remembering this correctly, because this was like pre-Twitter and stuff, people asked Philip Pullman how you decide what your demon is. And he was just like, I don't know, ask your friends.
So that's going to be our method.
Yeah, so at the end, we're going to assign each other demons.
That'll be the episode where we break up with each other, basically. Is
Well, I have friends that I've known for years who assigned me something. I'm not going to tell you what it is, because I don't want to bias you against it, but they thought it was hilarious and I was highly insulted. Anyways, we're gonna move on.
Okay. So if any of you guys have listened to the Desire Made Real podcast that Caitlin and I did with our friend Mandy about A Discovery of Witches, the TV show, you know that
we like talking about the science.
Yeah, we like talking about the science, and we like talking I like nitpicking about what parts of like portrayals of academia feel real and accurate or just like totally throw me out of the world. And so I don't think it like really is a good use of time to obsess over that angle in this world because it's like such an alternate dimension and kind of out of time. But I did want to just say that there was one thing that struck me as like really true. And that was Philip Pullman's description of the shoes of the servant versus the master. And so like, obviously the master has the status and the power in that relationship. But when he describes the shoes, like the servant has like very nice, shiny, well-kept shoes, and the master's shoes are super shabby. And that is just such a spot-on description of academia, where it's like the people with the most
so
power are always the ones who are like dressed the weirdest and have like the weirdest habits. And it's almost like, I mean, it's different depending on your subdiscipline. But for the most part, I think in a lot of places, it's like considered weird to dress up or to like spend a lot of time on your appearance. Because it's like, oh, well, if you're like caring about your clothes, you're obviously not paying enough attention to your work.
right.
Interesting.
Pullman is a Oxford academic, right? Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, he went to Oxford.
He taught part-time at Westminster College, which is one of the colleges at Oxford. But I don't think he has like advanced degrees besides the BA.
Well, I guess we could talk about like what year do we think is this happening in? What is the time period of these books?
So my first impression just from these first 4 chapters is I was going to guess maybe like the 1920s or like 30s approximately, like, because it's definitely, well, after 1898, but like at some point doesn't wine stop getting better and start getting worse? No? Is that not a thing? Like,
No, you're
eventually
right. You're
it's
right.
just vinegar. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I kind of, my impression is that, I don't know, like 20, 30 years or whatever is the sweet spot.
But I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't drink expensive wine. I drink like Trader Joe's wine.
I feel like it depends on the wine and how it was made and how it was bottled.
Yeah. I used to work in a fine dining restaurant, and we had very high-end wines that were like, I definitely served wines that were like 90 years old.
Ooh.
And were like hundreds of dollars.
Okay.
So, and people were like, this is amazing. So they were not drinking vinegar as far as I know. I didn't drink it.
I think the most expensive wine I've ever had was $50.
Ugh.
And it was really good.
I once drank a 200 euro bottle of wine, but this French woman brought it and the cork like crumbled into the wine and then she cried a lot. I know.
Oh,
it was
shit,
really,
that
I've never seen someone literally cry about wine before or since, really.
I have spent like $90 on champagne.
That totally counts. Bubbles.
Yeah. And that was also very, very good.
And then so the other thing that gave me the clue for the date was the gender politics. Just because the fact that there are no female scholars and
There are, but just in their own colleges.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So like very limited opportunities for like female scholarship and that it's completely segregated. So I kind of had it pegged as like early 20th century.
And Lyra totally looks down on those women.
Yeah.
And like I would be really upset with it if it hadn't already been like made clear how she thinks that Jordan is the best. And it's not that she's necessarily thinking, man, women suck.
Right.
So much as she's just like, the other colleges are all inferior, especially those women's colleges. And it's very clear just things that she's picked up from the men around her.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
and like that there have been no, like next to no female influences in her life.
Yeah. And I guess you guys, well, off air, you kind of let slip that you're spoiled that to some other clues about what the actual time is.
Well, I remember thinking, like the first time that I read this book, I don't actually remember what I thought, but it's really confusing because they have like gas lamps and, or oil lamps, sorry, and that sort of thing. And then they have electricity, but they call it something else.
Right.
Yeah.
So it took me a while. They call it Enberic, I think. Yeah. So it took me a while to get that it was electricity.
I think the reason for that,
yeah.
I was looking some of this up. I think amber is actually a really good conductor. Like a lot of the sort of subtle language stuff that Pullman is doing is basically like going back to a point where like there were 2 possible root words that could have been used to make a new term and then just like going the other way.
Right.
So it actually comes from the rock or the like hardened tree sap amber.
Yeah, he's definitely tapping on like a steampunk aesthetic, you know, whether you know what's going on or not. And there are other hints dropped too about like
the papacy got abolished.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's exactly what I was trying to remember, that Calvin was the Pope.
Yeah.
And that was the last Pope. And so you're like, wait a minute, that's weird. Yeah. But that's all going to fly over like a young adult's head, you know, in terms of like YA fiction. But I think it's still building like this is like our world, but not like our world at the same time. Like there's similarities and differences.
I love how he just sort of drops that in. Like They moved the papacy to Geneva, and then there was no more popes, and the magisterial court, or the magisterium took over and basically has complete control over the world.
It's so good. And it's like a confused bureaucracy of people just competing for power.
And yet they're not all speaking French. Because isn't Geneva the French part of Switzerland? I feel like they should all be speaking French. That's fine.
Well, see, this gets into other things that I'll talk about, because like you've already like mentioned, well, did the Spanish do this and would the French do that?
Yeah.
But there's like before Calvin and stuff, there's not really like, the countries aren't thinking of themselves as countries. They're like, it's Christendom.
That's fair. I see.
You know, it's like one thing. And then after that, it's when they start to be like nation states. France is like, we have to like, England sucks, right? Because that's how we measure ourselves. And England is like, France sucks because that's how we measure ourselves. And so like, that's where you get all the European colonialism from. But that's not the way that it was before that. It was just a bunch of competing kingdoms who all believed basically the same thing. And
also, as an Englishman, I'm sure Philip Pullman could never have French be like a bigger language than English.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah, it's just interesting world building. And I remember being, and with the gender politics and everything, it gives this really old fashioned feel to the world.
Yeah.
So you think it's early 1900s.
Right.
Yeah. And even just like the fashion itself that goes along with those gender politics, right? Like Lyra's always wearing skirts and dresses and
yeah,
like,
she's like this crazy wild child, but she's always in a dress.
And like the fact that, you know, they have like maids to get them dressed. Like I don't know, academia, like modern academia is somewhat regimented and like hierarchical, but not nearly to the extent that is depicted in this book, which I think is like much more similar to how academia was in like the early 20th century.
Yeah, like I think there's like 2 paragraphs spent on this is the land Jordan College owns and how it makes its money. So it feels very different from our world.
You know, it seems like what we're kind of feeling is like the absence of corporations and like the role that corporations play in modern life.
And also the absence of, like they're in England and they talk about the magisterium a lot, but they don't ever talk about the king and or queen of England or the prime minister or...
There's something named after George at some point. I did notice that.
Yeah, but they don't, it never comes up when they're talking about politics, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's like what I was saying about Calvin and, you know, and all of that. Because it basically, that if Calvin was the Pope, then that means that there was no Reformation, which means that like there was no Enlightenment and there was no rise of the nation state. Like it just radically changes European history to not have the Reformation, because then everybody in Europe thinks of themselves as one thing, instead of thinking of themselves as either I'm a Reformed Christian or I'm a Catholic. Or I guess you could say Orthodox in there, but that's like Eastern Europe and you know, is not like France and England and stuff.
So it feels like we're getting into religion here, which is our next topic of conversation.
Well, and I guess maybe like to transition a bit from the science side into the religion side, it definitely feels like in this world, science and religion are basically the same thing. Like there's no distinction between them. All of the like physical experiments that they're doing at Jordan College are under the label of experimental theology.
Right. Because you have to be within the framework of the Bible or the theology that's built off of the Bible, whatever that may be in this case, which was absolutely the case when people were doing alchemy or when they were like trying to work with spirits and stuff like that, and kind of a proto-science, you know, that was going on in like the 1100s to 1600s or so.
I don't know how relevant this is or like if this makes any sense, but it just seems like you mentioned the Bible, but there's like at the same time that religion and science are the same thing. The way that religion is portrayed is like much less religious, I guess, than like the way that we experience it in our world. Like, I don't know, there's not a lot of emphasis on
there's not a lot of people going to church and prayer and
no emphasis on like faith or belief or like the supernatural.
Like the Reformation didn't happen, is what you're saying. Weird.
Is that...
Yeah.
Where
people started to take the Bible literally and started to read it and say like, the way that we're doing Catholicism has nothing to do with all this stuff that Paul says and Jesus says. It's like we built up all these rules for 1,000 years while people couldn't read. And like the people who made up the rules kept everybody ignorant of what the actual rules in the book were. And then once people got wise to it and they like translated it into their local languages, then people were like, what the, you made us do what? And so like you get the rise of rationalism out of that. And then you also get like the wars that the Reformation causes, which make people realize that having a marriage between your state and religion is asking for trouble, because when your king converts, or your duke or your earl or whatever converts to whatever, like he was a Catholic and then he converts to Lutheranism, then everybody in the county is expected to convert to Lutheranism that minute. And if you don't, then you can get out of the county or you can be killed. And so like, what do you do? Like, what do you do? Your family's been there for generations. You go to war, and that like endless wars happen, and people are like, this is no way to run anything. So they pull apart religion and government, and you get the rise of the nation state and nationalism and all of that stuff. So
it really is like a super fundamental revisioning of our history.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's very important.
And apparently Calvin didn't give a shit about predestination. He was just like, whatever.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. So that's Calvin is like very famous for predestination.
That's like the one thing that I know about Calvin.
Sure, it's definitely the most important thing to know about Calvin is the idea that basically that like people are the people who are going to heaven, God already knew they were going to heaven. And so they were predestined to go there, that those people did not make like a choice that manipulated God. Instead, God knew what was going to happen, and those people are merely acting out kind of their fate, if you will. And that's actually a really important idea, the idea of like fate in these books, and the idea that like there is a God out there that knows what you are supposed to do and you should be doing it. Because we get that little aside, right, where we get this information that Lyra has a fate. There is something that she has to do.
No, so you're right. There is like the thread of predestination kind of running throughout the book, right? Because
absolutely,
the idea that the alethiometer can function at all, and that the master can like say all of this about Lyra and what's going to happen to her.
Yeah.
This is all very interesting to me because before I didn't know Calvin was a real person.
I did not pick up on the fact that Pope Calvin was that Calvin. Geneva should have been a clue. But
yeah, it's supposed to be, yes.
Yeah.
If you asked me to name a pope right now, I could not do it. Like any pope that existed ever, including whoever is pope right now.
No, not even JP2? Nope. Everybody loved JP2.
I don't know what that is.
John Paul
I get that
II.
that's probably a pope, but I got nothing.
Current pope? Francis? No.
Sure. I got nothing. There's like me on one side of the planet, and there's all of Catholicism on the other. I got nothing.
This is why you asked Alan to be on the podcast.
Yes, it is.
Oh yeah, this is my jam. That's what I do. I do think it's funny that Calvin ended the papacy in this universe. Like he's still, even though he's not a reformer, he's like, enough.
I got the idea that it was like the magisterium was like, yeah, we don't need a figurehead anymore. We're in charge. Fuck off. Yeah,
that's probably true. Especially since he seemed to have shaken things up so much by moving it to Geneva. Yeah. It kind of makes sense though, because it's like in the center of Europe too. right?
Yeah.
So it keeps it like, it's not just down there in Italy. Like they're able to get their fingers in everywhere.
Yeah.
And if you'd like to hear Alan and me rant about religion more, check out our Hallowed Ground Storycast episode about Crazy for God.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of other Christian stuff in here, just from the names, like Jordan College is like the River Jordan in the Holy Land. Jericho gets mentioned, Gabriel, Michael, those are archangels. Jericho's like the first city that the Israelites defeat with the strength of God. They bring down the walls of Jericho. So all of this stuff is like named after things in the Bible, and it's supposed to be like subtly letting you know that like, the Christian religion is very important in this setting. And like, I think it's interesting too that like the River Jordan like represents death, but also like freedom. So that's kind of interesting that Lyra starts there.
I see, that's really interesting. That's all the stuff that I think completely flew over my head when I was reading this book as a young teen, because all of the like subtle verbal references to Christianity without any like explicit religious practice, I don't think registered at all.
Oh, I think it totally works without knowing that stuff too, which is perfect. That's how it should be.
Well, there's this bit where the oh fuck, I forget his name. The dude in like the church. Oh God, that's not good. Where he like catches Lyra as she's running out of the
From
catacombs.
her demon coin switcheroo.
Yeah, I forget exactly who it is. Father somebody or other, and he asks her if she says her prayers, and she says, "Yeah."
But she's lying, clearly. Yeah,
but like he asks her a whole bunch of questions about whether or not she's lonely, and and I get this impression that he's genuinely concerned about her well-being, and that he's a good guy. And I just like, that is the only mention I think of prayers that we get in this whole series, maybe, of like, do you actually do any of this religious stuff? And she's just like, yeah. And she runs off.
And even there, it's not like a prayer to a personal God. He's not asking like, do you talk to God like in a personal way? He's saying like, do you recite the rote prayers that have been like handed down from antiquity to you? And she's like, totally. Yeah, I love that stuff. That's great. Can I go?
I love Lyra so much.
Yeah, she's perfect.
That whole conversation with him is basically, no. Do you say your prayers? Yep. Bye.
Yeah.
He doesn't know what to do with her.
Yeah.
None of those guys do. And you get Azrael, who does seem to know what to do with her, which is like throw out juicy tidbits to get her interested in whatever he wants her to be interested in and do his bidding. And Azrael is actually also a reference, like Jordan and Jericho and all that stuff. You guys probably know this, but Azrael is the name of Gargamel's cat from the Smurfs. And Philip Pullman is a huge Smurfs fan.
I have not seen a single second of Smurfs.
Well, if you watch it, you would know that Gargamel's pussy is the most dangerous thing in the Smurfs. So that's why he named Azrael that. I don't even know what
to say to that.
No, that's not what Lord Asriel is named after. I'm sorry. That's not true. Both the cat and Lord Asriel are named after the angel of death from the Quran, actually.
I'd heard the term Azrael as the angel of death before, but I just hadn't put it together with Azrael from these books.
Of course, from Smurfs, yeah.
Right.
I was trying to think of when was the first time I heard Azrael, and it was definitely the Smurfs, because I used to watch that every time I could catch it. I loved the Smurfs when I was a kid.
I know the Smurfette principle is literally the only thing I know about the Smurfs, and it's a warning of what not to do. Which
Smurfette was created by Gargamel.
Have one fucking female character. Don't do it.
But there's not even a female. They're fungus. They don't need a female. She's created by Gargamel to normalize their
fungi have like so many sexes. Like
let's not get into
don't get
this
Anya
is just
started
her
on
and
fungi.
me trying to impress each other.
The fungi.
Yeah.
If you'd like to hear more about me talking about fungi, there's so many other podcasts where I do only that.
Anyways, you've got a note here about shamanism and demons. Why don't we talk about that?
Yeah. So demons, right? We've been talking about demons and how that works in this world, and it's definitely one of the most interesting world building features, I think, in the series, but also like in this first 4 chapters. So the word demon, that comes from Greek. It just means a spirit, and so that like totally works, right? These animals have some kind of mystical, spiritual connection to their humans. And to me, that speaks of like shamanism, where you will have like a shamanic practitioner who has like some kind of bond with an animal or is able to transform into animals. And if you go into religious studies, this is like religion 101, is that every religion starts out as a shamanic religion that is related to animals. And then as it like increases in sophistication, then you start to introduce more human gods and stuff like that. But they never totally lose their animal connection. And so you'll get stuff like Zeus is associated with eagles, or like Odin is like associated with horses, and stuff like that. So like the idea there is that once upon a time, someone in Greece was actually worshiping eagles, but then it like evolved into Zeus, if you can understand what I'm saying there. And so what I see Pullman doing here is tapping the idea of mystic shamanism and like this close connection that you have with an animal and just kind of making it totally mundane. Like this is the most normal thing in this world for everyone to have a talking animal that's with them constantly. Like nobody finds this remarkable. And so he's taking this very elemental religious concept and making it the core building block of like your relationship in this world. But at the same time, you have this irrational kind of thing going on with shamanism and the mystical connection between the animals. But at the same time, I think you have this connection with this guy called Carl Jung, who was like a psychologist in the early 20th century. Who
he was
had
originally a protege of what's his face?
Freud.
Yeah.
That's right.
But then they had Freud's like a big falling out, right?
Well, they were okay at the end, but yeah, you're right. They were definitely rivals after he was their student. Mm-hmm. And Jung's whole thing was this idea of, so you have like your ego, which is like your thinking mind, and then you have your unconscious, which I think everybody knows what your unconscious mind is. It's like ticking in the background, working on things while you're not aware of them. And then you had the collective unconscious, right? Mm-hmm. That's way back there and kind of like cultural information that you're just not aware of, but still has an effect over your psyche. Now, all this stuff is kind of like debunked now, but authors love to use this stuff because it's like real crunchy. And I think Pullman is totally doing that here because Jung had this idea called the anima, which right there, you get the word that is the same base word for animal, mm-hmm. the anima, and that is the Latin word for spirit, just like demon. So animals are spirits, just like the demon. And the idea of the anima in Jung's whole framework is that it is a kind of photographic negative of who you are as a person. So like you're a woman, and so your anima would be male, and it would be like an opposite personality to you. So if you're very brave, it would be very cowardly. And you see this in the demons. Like this is the way that they work, right? Pantalaimon and Lyra. They are always the opposite gender, and they are kind of having the other side of the conversation, like you said earlier.
It's not always like that, but yeah.
But that's Jung's idea of the anima. Yeah. You would be like talking in your mind, like, if I was going to go talk to that boy, what would he say? And like that. And you play it out in your mind that way. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a psychic reflection of yourself. And this is kind of like a very rational way to like frame this relationship. But I think he's doing them simultaneously. So you have this very irrational tradition of mysticism and this very rational framework of psychology, and he's blending them together. And that is like the core concept of his world building. Like he does this constantly, where he has like this irrational religious stuff, and then he marries it with like rational scientific stuff. And the result is like this very unique world that's it's very interesting to poke around in.
I think, okay, so in that movie that everybody loves to hate on,
Yeah.
I think there's a bit where Mrs. Coulter slaps her demon. And I've read so many reviews that are like, why would anyone ever do that? That doesn't make any sense. And in my head, I'm like, you must be really like good with yourself to not understand how you would do
Right?
that. You know?
Right?
Like, there are so many times when I've been like, what the fuck, Caitlin? Like, where
Absolutely.
I wish there was this other part of me that I could just slap across the face and be like, make better choices. So,
No, I
Yeah.
agree. That's funny.
I'm honestly shocked that, like, everybody isn't better in that world, considering that they have their actual embodied conscious yelling at them all the time.
Do you feel like it's their like a Jiminy Cricket, or
Well, Pan seems to function that way a little bit to Lyra, but she also just doesn't listen to him, so.
I think Pan functions that way because Lyra's a wild child liar person, you know, and also still a child. So there's that.
Mhm.
But I do wish we got a little bit more of the adults interacting with their demons, because I think that's way more interesting, because they have like, we need to come up with a plan conversations with their demons, you know?
Yeah.
Not, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do?
Well, and that plays into like the other thing that I wanted to talk about really quick with the demons. And we were talking about this earlier with the dogs and like your destiny and all of this stuff being tied to your demon, because there's this idea of teleology. I don't know if you guys have ever heard about this before. It's a fundamental thing in like philosophy. It's like philosophy 101. You'd learn about teleology. So with Jung, you had these archetypes, which included animals. And so like you would have a dream and you would see like a snake or something like that. And then in the Jungian framework, it would be like that snake means XYZ. It symbolizes this thing. And so that's kind of like what the demons are doing in terms of your job, right? Like your opportunities seem to be tied to your animal, or at least in the first chapter, we find out that all the servants are dogs. Like, doesn't seem to be any exceptions to that. And even the type of servant you are is tied to the type of dog. Like, we find out the head servant is a really cool dog. And so, if you got to say something,
I was just to play devil's advocate on this. I actually very much agree that it's all bullshit. That there would definitely be like some servants with non-dog, but just to come at it from the other point of view, I guess I can see where if you were raised your whole life to be a servant, like that would shape your personality. You know,
you see that in the little boy, right? When
Yeah.
he is being obsequious, it turns into a dog. His demon turns into a dog.
So if you were raised your whole life to be a servant, you would just sort of think, of course, my demon's going to be a dog, and that would affect how you turn out, which is kind of an interesting way to look at it. Yeah, if you were apprenticed to be a higher up servant, same thing.
Yeah, or a noble.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you would get the nobler dog, as it were.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, totally right. And that is exactly like the way that Aristotle imagined the perfect society, as like people being kind of in their place and doing what they're supposed to do. So teleology is this idea that it comes from the Greek word telos, which means like your reason, or like the end. Like you've heard the ends justify the means. Telos is like the end, or like people say everything happens for a reason. Telos is the reason. Everything happens for telos. And so the idea here is like, imagine at the end of this podcast, you went to pick up your smartphone, and when you picked it up, it said, "I am a banana. You should eat me." Like, your smartphone would no longer be a good smartphone. It would not teleologically be a good smartphone because it thinks it's a banana. It would not be able to communicate with other things. It would not be able to like post pictures, play video games, take, organize stuff, whatever you use your smartphone for, because it thinks it's a banana. It's like, you should eat me. It's also not a good banana because it's confused about what its teleological purpose is in the world. And so this would be like the same thing as somebody has a dog for a demon and says like, I should be the master of the college. They'd be like, no, kiddo, you're a banana. Like you're a dog. You need to fit your place. You have a purpose in this world. And this goes back to Calvin, right? And fate and who is chosen for what purpose. Everybody has a place to fill and you don't get a choice about it. It's just, your teleological purpose manifests itself in your demon.
And that's why all the poor people are dumb or drunk.
Yep.
Well, that's cheerful.
No, totally.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, it's a dystopia, right? There's a lot of dystopian elements in these first 4 chapters, I think, where you feel like that there's a heavy oppression to things and there's a lot of like social violence going on. There's physical violence that's threatened on people or just outright committed on them. And so like there's a darkness to this book.
That's
right
an interesting point actually about it being a dystopia, because I feel like every other dystopian book I've ever read is told from the point of view of the people at the bottom, and Lyra is very much not at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
So you almost don't see it as a dystopia, but now that you bring it up, I can see what it absolutely is.
Yeah. Yeah. The magisterium is like the way that they're in charge of things is, like I said, I see it as a very like orderly system where everything is very fated. Like I see a lot of, I think Pullman is purposely like using ideas from Calvin and like teleological principles, which were very important to the early Catholic Church. Well, not the early Catholic Church, but the church after the Crusades, and kind of like telling everyone like you have a place to fill in the order of things, and like your choice doesn't matter in that. And to modern people, where our individuality and we have this idea of that we have rights that are intrinsic to being a human being, like all of this just hits us sideways, and we're like, This is gross. This is not okay. Mm-hmm. Or hopefully it is. It's probably very familiar to children too, right? Who are in school or who might have bad parents. Like this is easy to relate to, I think.
I think you're totally right, Kate, about that not really feeling like a dystopian world, because like the traditional way that dystopian stories are told is like a person going up against the system with like some sort of awareness of that. Whereas this story feels much more just like an adventure story where Lyra is being driven by her own curiosity. So like the tone is different, even if like the kind of world building setting parts are similar.
Lyra doesn't start out to take down the system. If anything, the dystopia story is being told from Lord Asriel's point of view. But we don't get that. And he is also very, very much not at the bottom.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's weird to compare it to dystopian fiction directly, I guess. But I just find the tone of the world building dystopian, I guess.
Yeah, no, I like that you brought that up because I just never thought about it before. But you're right.
I think that's all my religious crap.
Did we have anything else we wanted to talk about before we moved on?
I did. I was reminded by the Gobblers made me think of this situation that happened to Jewish kids in Russia right after Catherine the Great was in charge of things. Her son was a huge anti-Semite. So is Catherine the Great, by the way. And they basically like made a bunch of laws that made it illegal to be Jewish in Russia. And yeah, because why wouldn't you? Anti-Semitism in Europe. So her son makes this law that says if you are a Jewish boy and you are 12 years old, then you are drafted in the military. And you will serve a military service of 25 years minimum.
Jesus.
Yeah. So basically, we're going to kill you, or we're going to deprogram your culture, essentially. And it was like, if someone turned 12 years old, if a Jewish boy turned 12 years old and didn't show up, then the military police showed up at your house in the dead of night, kicked down the door, and dragged the children out of their homes and took them to military camp. So that's like a very real thing that this made me think of, this idea of like poor people who can't really fight back in this story, having their children taken from them, and kind of the terror of that.
Yeah, there's even a line at some point where like the police begrudgingly get involved after enough children have disappeared.
Yeah.
Like, what the fuck?
Well, and if we're going to talk about children being taken away from their parents in 2019, like,
right,
America, concentration camps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
It's I don't want to use the word strange, but it's the only word that's popping into my head. Strange how this book written in 1995 is so incredibly relevant 25 years later.
Yeah. Which I think we talked about a bit in our trailer episode. So Alan and I have our other podcast about American Gods, and that's another book where like was published in the 90s and is super, super relevant today with all of its themes about immigration and like hatred and stuff. Yeah, I think this book is gonna be similarly relevant in different ways. So, Kate, I want to hear your take on Mrs. Coulter so far, because I know she's one of your favorite parts of this book.
Mm-hmm,
and I remember really liking her, but also I felt a little bit annoyed by her so far in just these chapters, because I kind of feel like she's like too good at what she does. Like does she have some kind of magical whammy that she's putting on people, or is her personal charisma just that strong? Like it just seems a little bit like, you know, I mean, I don't want to glorify the concept of Mary Sue more than it deserves, which is not very much, but you know, like the like hot girl who walks down the street and everyone is like, oh, you know, like it just seems like a little too otherworldly.
Okay, so we don't get all this in these chapters, but for me, Mrs. Coulter has always just been someone who doesn't have any stopping point. You know, like she doesn't have maybe I went too far here.
Mm-hmm.
So without that, what can't a person do? You know, like what can't a person get for themselves? So we see her in these chapters as being a female scholar, but not like the female scholars that Lyra like looks down on. You know, Mrs. Coulter seems worldly and like she's actually gone out and done stuff, and Lyra's immediately transfixed by her. And a lot of I think that has to do with how Lyra hasn't had, you know, female influences in her life. And then here's this woman who comes in who's appearing to have lots of money and influence and does the things that Lyra wants to do. You know, she talks about having gone north and bringing Lyra north with her and exploring and all that sort of thing.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I feel like I should clarify. I totally get why Lyra loves Mrs. Coulter and why Lyra specifically is enchanted with her.
Mm-hmm.
What I don't understand as well is how all of the, like, random street urchins are just, like, totally trusting of her immediately off the bat, right? Because Lyra has an official introduction,
right? And
also Mrs. Coulter specifically appeals to her in these certain ways that she like doesn't to Tony and to all the other kids that she's stealing.
Well, we kind of talked about her being the white witch, you know, here's some chocolate when you haven't had a good dinner in weeks or something.
That's fair. I guess it is like an archetype that's not just the Mary Sue archetype, right? It's like older and deeper and more witchy than that.
Yeah, and I was going to say with Mrs. Coulter, with learning that she's a scholar and also learning about some of the gender politics in the world, we can assume that she's had to work really hard to get to where she is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, totally.
So there's so many different parts of Mrs. Coulter that I can't even really discuss yet. But we do see that she will do anything for what she wants, and she doesn't care. Like she just lied to those kids straight up and was like, absolutely, I will give your parents these letters. I'm sure they'll miss you and I'm sure you'll miss them. And it's really sad, but you're going to be helping us so much. And thank you so much. And then she just burns those letters and she just doesn't give a shit.
But also that she's totally willing to go through the motions of, and all of this labor of like writing the letters in order to make the kids easier to manipulate, right? Because like she's not going to just use force, right? She has to manipulate you into cooperating. Yeah.
Once they were in the building, she could have just locked them up, but no, she gave them the hot chocolate. She let them write the letters, and then they loved her.
Yeah.
Right.
Because like part of her deal is that I think she needs to be loved and admired on some level while she's doing all of this heinous shit.
Well, it just makes people easier to deal with if they love you, right? If you can make that happen, it's just easier to do. I think she's also like playing off of gender stereotypes in her time. Like she's limited by her gender, but it's like, well, if this is all I got to work with, then I'll be like the most maternal, most beautiful, most woman. That's how I see Miss Coulter. Like I see Lord Asriel as most man and Mrs. Coulter as most woman. And then but that's not like intrinsic to her character. It's like her tool to get what she wants.
I see. And maybe that just like that particular type of femininity is not something that exists in this world in enough quantity that it takes people off guard and by surprise and makes them more easily manipulated.
Yeah, at least not in the circles that she runs in.
Yeah.
Yeah, not with these poor kids who
But also not with scholars and not with who we learn later is like fronting the money on the gobblers.
My favorite Mrs. Coulter line at some point, it says that like she lowered her scented head and it like abstracts her in such a odd and chilling way that like it just kind of underlines that facade to her. Like her head is scented and like the way she's lowering it to the child to be like, oh yes, dear, whatever you need. And it's like, wow, you're very creepy.
I really like when she's talking to Lyra and Lyra sort of offhand mentions Lord Asriel in the North. And then Mrs. Coulter is immediately like, oh yeah, he was telling me about that. And like, she just immediately sees that this is the way to Lyra.
Yeah.
And everybody else sort of looks at Mrs. Coulter and then everybody is just like, okay, I'm not touching that.
Yeah. She's a fantastic character. Both of these like female characters are so like three-dimensional and crunchy in a way that a lot of the male characters are a little bit flatter, which is cool.
Yeah, at least in this first book.
So since we talked about the characterization of Mrs. Coulter, do we want to just take a couple minutes to talk about the characterization of Lord Asriel and his relationship with Lyra, especially since you mentioned in the trailer episode that was the one part that you were kind of most skeptical about, the casting of Lord Asriel.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess in this we see Asriel, threaten to break Lyra's arm after he finds her hiding in the retiring room where she's not supposed to be.
And he doesn't come across as joking.
No, he doesn't.
No.
And he's very, he's very old man almost. Like I can't think of any other way to describe that.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's funny, like I put this into our problematic section, but it's actually something that I had to like, it was not problematic to me when I read it. It was something that I was thinking like, what stuff is problematic? And then this came up in my mind because to me, like this powerful, manly man, like, of course he would threaten violence on a child because like as a child, that was my entire experience. It was like, oh, you knocked over a glass of milk. Well, I should punch you in the face. Like that was the response that adults had with me personally. And so this kind of like trauma and violence that exists in Lyra's world, this like casual, I should just break your arm. I was like, yeah, of course. That's how men deal with children. That's normal. And so like for me, I appreciate this in the book from Pullman putting it in there because I feel like fantasy fiction is an escape for a lot of kids, especially a lot of like traumatized kids. And so to see themselves and their relationship with adults like very clearly laid out in a book, like this is not like Lord of the Rings, right? Like this is some real shit. And you can be like, oh, I'm like this little girl. I totally understand everything about her, like instantly.
Well, it's so weird though, because like this happens, but Lyra still wants it. Well, I guess that's not weird. Like as far as we know, Lyra doesn't really have much of a relationship with Lord Asriel.
Mm-hmm.
Like he comes in every now and then, asks her some questions, gives her $5 golden.
He's like Willy Wonka.
I was confused about the dollars, but whatever. Moving on.
Wait, just the word dollars?
Yeah, because they're in England, and then later on somebody's talking about like shillings, I think, which different money denominations. I don't know.
You know, there's like 25 shillings in a dollar.
No idea.
Britain uses pounds. I was just really confused by that one. Okay, so we're just going to move on because there's no answers.
Yeah. Well, no, I think, again, that's just like one of those... Sorry. I think, again, that's just like one of those world-building things, right? Where it's like everything is just slightly different. Like, maybe they could have decided to use the word dollar.
I guess. Anyways, but like they don't have much of a relationship. So when he threatens this like violence on her, she's just like, yeah, that's cool. And that's it.
Yeah, it normalizes it in a way that like, so that tells you a few things. It like tells you that this is normal behavior for Asriel, and it tells you that like Lyra doesn't think it's a big deal. So either adults regularly, approach her with violence, or like this is just their normal relationship. She doesn't find it remarkable at all. And so like that's some really good writing.
But also I think she approaches her relationships with other kids at like similar levels of violence, right? Like the power imbalance isn't similar, but when they talk about her like warfare with the kids from the other colleges or versus the townies or versus the Egyptians, like, that's her whole worldview is through like people using their power to inflict violence on each other.
Yep.
But then she still greatly admires Asriel.
Yeah.
I mean, I loved my dad and looked up to him and wanted to be like him. You know what I mean?
I get
that's
that.
Normal.
I suppose I get that being your dad, but they don't have that type of relationship. But I guess she doesn't have anything else. So
it's true.
And he comes by once or twice a year and brings her presents. Like,
yeah, that's fair.
And he's like a big deal in the college. Like everybody's like, ooh. Yeah. So that makes her kind of a big deal by association. But yeah, no, it's just like, I really appreciated this from Pullman. Like, I think on the one hand, it does exactly what Anya is saying, where you should notice it in the story and be like, there's a lot of violence in this world. Like it adds to that darkness. Or if you were a kid like me, you'd be like, oh, wow, this is a world that I understand. This isn't like Narnia, where it's like all like, oh, it's hospitality right up front from the fawns and nymphs. Like, I can't relate to that as a child. Like, that doesn't make sense to me emotionally. Like, people don't just give you stuff. They want something from you. In this world, like, it makes way more sense that I'm going to break your arm or I'm going to give you chocolate and then I'm going to kidnap you. Like, this world makes sense to who I was as a child versus like Narnia. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also, after reading these chapters, I totally get what you were saying about the trailer, Caitlin, that like here Lord Asriel is just so cold and he seems like very emotionless and just like personally driven. And like James McAvoy definitely has like a warmth and a humanity to his performance that is not really on the page here.
Yeah, but also like he threatened to break Lyra's arm here just for her being in the wrong room, and in the trailer she's like yelling at him in anger, and he's just like it just brushes off him. So that kind of rubbed me the wrong way with Asriel, but at the same time I'm interested to see the journey that they take that Asriel on, because he seems like he's just a completely different dude. All right, so that wraps up this episode on chapters 1 to 4. For our next episode, we will be talking about chapters 5 to 9.
If you like our show, please take the time to leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. And if you'd like to reach me, I'm Anya, and you can follow me on Twitter at StrangelyLiteral. That's strangely, then LITERL.
And I'm Caitlin, and you can follow me on Twitter at InferiorCaitlin.
You can follow the show on Twitter at MOTPod, Measures of Truth Pod. Do you need more than 200 characters to speak your mind? Then send us an email to contact@hallowedgroundmedia.com.
We'll see you all next time, and remember to not get caught by the gobblers.